Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, and I manage the SAGE Research Methods community. I'm pleased to be joined today by Julianne Cheek and Elise Obi, and we're discussing their book on research design. But before we get started, if you're new to our community, we're interested in everything to do with designing, conducting, analyzing research, writing about it, and sharing results in all different kinds of ways. And at the heart of this diagram, we have teaching and learning, because we think that whether you are just starting or you are very experienced, we all have something to learn, which is why I enjoy this kind of opportunity to really think through, some of the issues. So we're going to talk about chapter 10 in the book right now. And in this discussion, we're going to focus on the reflexive thinking that underpins the development of mixed methods design. So putting that another way, we're going to focus on why and how using mixed methods thinking when designing research enables us to better answer our research problem or questions and contribute new knowledge in the area of interest. So to begin, what does mixed methods really mean?
Okay, well, I'll take that question. And just for those of you who haven't watched any podcasts, I'm Julianne Cheek, and the other co-author, Elise Obi, is here, and we'll be adding comments on the way through. I think what Janet just said then is really important to set the tone for this podcast, and that is that mixed methods is neither better or worse than a single method study. It can be better, and it can actually be worse, depending on what your research problem or question is. As we've been emphasizing in other podcasts and throughout the book, methods are chosen and ways of collecting information are chosen in order to answer specific research problems or questions. And whether or not it's appropriate for you to use a mixed methods approach in your study will depend on what your research question is and what a mixed methods approach offers you that a single approach cannot. So it's very important to start with that. So what does mixed methods actually mean? Well, when you begin reading in this area, you will start asking yourself that question many times. This has been an area where in the last 20 to 30 years, there's been a lot of writing all at once, and many people have had slightly different viewpoints about what mixed methods is. The most common viewpoint about what mixed methods research is that it is a study design or research design that in some way involves more than one method. Okay, and the most common view about that is that the methods that it involves are both qualitative and quantitative approaches in the same study. So that's a very common definition of mixed methods research, that it is an approach that combines qualitative and quantitative approaches in the one study. Classic, a very prominent researcher who's done a lot of work using and employing that model of mixed methods research is John Creswell, and it won't take you long before you read in the area before you come across that. However, there are other people that take slightly different inflections on what mixed methods research is. They say that, yes, it might be about combining methods, but it can also be about combining ways of thinking qualitatively and thinking quantitatively in the one study. Okay, now an example of that would be one of the originators of mixed methods research, which is Jennifer Green. Okay, and Green puts a lot of emphasis on the thinking that's involved. And again, I don't have time to go into that, but I'm just saying that we can talk about it as involving qualitative and quantitative methods, and that is by far the most common definition of mixed methods. Then there's one that puts emphasis on thinking, all right, as well as combining those methods. And then there's people who say that mixed methods is when we use more than one method in a single study. So we are using more than one method in a single study. That's common to most definitions. But for some reason, one of the methods is incomplete and cannot stand on its own. So in this definition of mixed methods, we have a complete core component of the mixed methods study that can be qualitative or it can be quantitative. And what demarcates the study as mixed methods research is that the supplementary component or the other part of the study is incomplete in some way. So for example, I might do a complete interview study and then I might want to collect some statistics about something to do with that interview study, but that won't be a complete statistics-based study. Similarly, I might do a massive survey in a population and I might want to follow up a couple of people with a couple of interviews to ask them questions about one of the questions in the survey. So it's not a qualitative study as such, but what it is using some qualitatively derived information to supplement or support the information found in the core component of the study. Now, the person who has put forward that definition of mixed methods is also one of the pioneers of mixed methods research, and that is Janice Morse. So we have those three people are three of the early people that were involved in putting the parameters of mixed methods research out there. They vary slightly in their definitions of mixed methods research. So what really is important is that when you are going to use mixed methods in your study, that you are aware of, one, why you are using it, and that is because in some way you think that adding two types of information together, two types of data, two types of methods in the one study will enhance your answer to that research question or problem. Okay, that's the first thing. And then you will need to think about what definition of mixed methods research are you going to use in your study and why? State that, justify it, and then operate according to those parameters. So I have seen and read excellent studies published using Morse's definition of the core component and the supplementary component being incomplete. I have also read excellent research where the definition of mixed methods research in play is that it must involve a qualitative and quantitative component. In Morse's definition, it's about the incompleteness of the supplementary component, that you don't have to do a full-blown second study. You can use some information from that to support the first study. So in her definition, it's possible to have qualitative and qualitative in the one. That would give you a mixed method study. What would make it a mixed method study is the first part would be a full qualitative study. The second part would be an incomplete qualitative study that in some way enhances that first qualitative study. And same with quant. You would have a quantitative study that is fully developed and the other component would in some way enhance that. In the book, we give some examples of that. And you also should, of course, if you're working in this area, go back to the primary sources like Creswell, like Morse, and see what they are talking about, and then what definition you are going to employ. But the key thing is, what do all mixed methods approaches have in common? In some way, they combine different methods, different types of information and knowledge in the one study. They vary in the detail of how they might do that, but they all have in common that. Most definitions of mixed methods research are that those two components are a qualitative and a quantitative, or a quantitative and a qualitative component. However, I have told you that if you allow for the definition that mixed methods is that one component is incomplete, you can have qualitative, qualitative, quantitative, quantitative. The other thing that they all have in common, okay, is that no matter what approach you decide to adopt, you are going to be making decisions when you design your research about the priority of the components in the study. Which is going to be your main component? Is it going to be, if you're using qual, is it going to be a quantitative component with a qualitative component that follows that? Are they going to have equal weighting? Remembering that under Morse's definition, that would not be mixed methods research, because in her definition, one of the components by necessity is incomplete. Now we're starting to get sophisticated and why you need to get into those definitions. Okay, so you need to look at the priority or weighting that's given to the components. Is it qualitatively driven? is it quantitatively driven? So is it big qual to little quan? These are the terms you'll see, QUAL in capitals and quan in QUAN in little letters. What that means is that the major weighting is to the qualitative component and the quantitative data is the secondary component in the study. Is it capital QUAN with small QUAL? Then it's a quantitatively driven project where you might have done a couple of focus groups or you might have analysed some open-ended text in a survey to supplement the quantitative data collected in the quantitative component that has given the priority or weighting in the project. That qualitative data could not stand alone if it's simply supplementing the quantitative data. So it's a mixed methods approach. You can't separate them out. However, Creswell's definition allows for big qual and big quan to go together in a study, and therefore they would be standing alone. But the question that Morse and others would ask of that is, well, what makes that different to multiple methods? And I don't want to get into that because we're starting to get into some quite difficult stuff. But so one thing is the priority. The second thing that all mixed method studies have to consider is the pacing or timing of your components. Which one will you do first? Will you do the qualitative component first, or the qualitative first and the quantitative second, or the quantitative first and the qualitative second, or will you do them at the same time? And why? And this is called the timing or pacing of the components. If you are doing them at the same time, it is called a simultaneous mixed methods design, where you are doing the components simultaneously, or sequential, right? I've done my interview I've done my interviews, and now I want to find out how many people actually think about that in that way, only one part of that interview. So I might do a supplementary quantitative study in some way. Or I've done a quantitative study and I've got an answer to something where people are referring to something, and I need to go and study a bit more about that and interview some people about that. I'm not going to do a full-blown interview study, but I'm doing a follow-on, a sequential, small qualitative component. The core component is the quantitative survey. The supplementary component or the secondary component is the qualitative interviews. So you're going to have to think about priority or weighting, which is driving this research. Is it the quantitative or qualitative thinking, or are you trying to weight them equally? All right, remembering that one definition doesn't allow for that. What is the timing and pacing of the components? Will they be done together simultaneously? Will they be done one after the other, flow on, sequential? And the big question, of course, in this is in the name of this research design and approach that's often overlooked, and that is mixing. Like, what exactly are you going to mix? How is this mixed? Is the mixing only about the fact that you have two different methods? In which case, well, that loses most of the effect of the promise of what mixed methods research can do. So you need to think about, what are you going to mix, when and how? So if you do a quantitative survey and you want to get some qualitative data about some aspect or question of that survey, what are you going to do with that qualitative data? How are you going to mix it with that survey data? How are you going to report it? Or if you're doing a qualitative study and you've done a whole heap of interviews and you wanted to go out and quantify some aspect of that interview, but you haven't quantified everything and you probably haven't done a full-blown quantitative study, what are you going to do with that quantitative information? How are you going to mix it with that qualitative component in the first that you did initially, that the quantitative data relates to? Because the components relate to each other. So when we start splitting them off, the question is, in my head, are we doing mixed methods anymore? What's the difference between just doing a quantitative study and a qualitative study if we're not mixing them? If they're both full studies, how are we going to mix them? How are we going to report them? What is going to be mixed, etc., etc.? So I've complicated things a little bit, but I think it's important to do that because you will find that people are talking about slightly different things in this field. But for those of you coming to the field, key points to remember from what I've said so far. The predominant definition of mixed methods research is that it involves two different approaches, quantitative and qualitative in some way. All right. But remember, not everybody agrees with that. And Jan Morse has done a lot of work in this area as a pioneer about the supplementary idea that it's an incomplete study, the second part. Second thing is, no matter whether you're using Morse, whether you're using Cresswell, whatever you're using in your mixed methods research design, you will need to consider three aspects in your design. You will need to consider the priority or the weighting of each component. Which is your main one? Which one comes first? How are they oriented with each other?
Mm.
And the capitalization will reflect that. Capitals means that it is a core priority component, right? So QUAN in capitals mean that this is a quantitatively driven project. It's a core component, fully developed component. If you use a small QUAL, it means it's a qualitative supplementary component that in some way is supplementing that quantitative data. If you use capital QUAN and capital QUAL, what you're telling me is you've got two fully developed standalone studies. So you've got a question to answer then, and that is, how are you going to mix them? Like, what are you going to mix out of your two fully developed studies? So you have to consider the priority or weighting. You have to consider the timing, which will be done first, or will they be done at the same time? So have you got a sequential study where one will be done first and the second follow, or have you got a simultaneous study where they will be done at the same time? And then the big $1 million question. Yes, you've got all this. How are you going to mix it? What are you going to mix, when, and how? So you have a lot of thinking to do in mixed methods research design.
Anything you want to add to that, Elise?
I just came over a study that I used in pretty recent teaching. And there the students, these were master students, two of them, they had used, they had the core component, their big study was a quantitative study about why women quit working for the police. And they were trying to map like the reasons why these women quit. And then they went, like, they did it the normal quantitative way, going to the literature, finding what other people had written about why people quit, and then these were the focus of their quantitative study. But then they realized that maybe we're missing something. Maybe we should actually do a qualitative, smaller, incomplete study first, where we talk to some of these women who have quit working for the police and see, are there any possible reasons that we're missing when we're only looking for possible reasons in the literature. And so they had this type of design where they did this small qualitative interview-based study to inform, to enhance their possible the credibility of the answers they could possibly find on their big complete quant study. So they actually did this, but they don't talk about mixed methods in their writing. And I think maybe it's because it's the master students and it's really hard to write about this in a good way. So they just say that they use a small qual study to inform the big quant study.
Well, certainly a lot to think about when you're trying to use two different approaches and make sense out of the kinds of insights that you can gain from each type. So anything else that you want to add?
No, but I think, you know, the question of why to use mixed methods in the first place is what we've been talking about a bit as well, because when you're designing your mixed methods research, no matter how you do it, you know, given the variety that's around, etc., the key of using mixed methods in the first place is to enable a better understanding of the focus of the research than you would have if you didn't mix.
Mhm.
And that's something that people have to keep in mind. If I'm using mixed methods, the goal isn't, you know, to do a qual and a quant study. That's not the goal. That's the means,
Right.
right? The goal is a better understanding of the focus of your research than you would have if you did not mix. That means that, yes, Elisa, those people missed a great opportunity because what they failed to, or not failed, but what they didn't do, capitalize on, was they were obviously thinking that it will enable them to answer the focus of their
Yes.
question better, but they lost the opportunity to show that had happened, how it had happened, and why it had happened. And that's a good example of what is missing in much of the reporting of mixed method studies. People go into more like a technical sort of thing of how they did an instrumental approach to mixed method studies. And they forget that mixed methods is a research design, just like any other thing, like discourse analysis or like, I don't know, some sort of survey design or whatever else. And it needs to be justified. It needs to be explained. And what happens at each point, it's not a black box and suddenly we put it in, mix it up, and out comes this. We need to actually explain what we're doing and why. And most importantly, why did your research question require a mixed methods approach? What does it give me that it doesn't? And, you know, we emphasize, and I would emphasize again today, that if you're going to use a mixed methods approach, you have to do that thinking before the study starts and during it. So your example is they're thinking about it as they're getting into designing their research, and that's excellent. The thinking is happening and it's going to improve the outcome of the research. I was involved in some research in a mindfulness study that's been reported and it's easily found. It's published in Qualitative Health Research, where we were analysing letters that students wrote about their experience of doing mindfulness in primary school very early on, right, when mindfulness was not trendy and was not known. And what we found was there were things in the letters that we didn't understand. So we added a supplementary component to that study and justified it in the article by going and tracking down some of the students and asking them, can you remember 10 or 15 years ago or 20 years ago when you wrote that? What did you mean by that? And that's a classic example of a sequential project that developed and evolved in our design. We didn't set out to do that, but that greatly enhanced our understanding of the letters. And these are the sorts of reasons for why we would use mixed methods research. And then we go into the type of mixed methods and the design, etc. I just wanted to read a quote, Janet, from Elizabeth Creamer, who is an outstanding mixed methods researcher and has written a fantastic book with the emphasis on mixing. So she's taken the really hard area and tried to unravel it. She reminds us, and I'm quoting now, mixing is the key mechanism for the value added of mixed methods research and its potential to create creative and coherent explanations and conclusions. So mixing is critical. And she says it is mixing which increases the comprehensiveness, the cohesiveness, the robustness, and the theoretical power of inferences and conclusions. So, you know, if you're going to use mixed methods research and mixing isn't very prominent or isn't very prominently explained, you're missing the power and value of the mixed methods research. It is much more than just having two methods present.
Well, we hope you'll take a look at Chapter 10 and learn a little bit more about what has been explained here today. So thank you very much.